Imagine the hush of a moonlit Virginia evening. Soft crickets sing in the tall grass and a gentle river murmurs nearby. The stars above shine like quiet witnesses to the birth of a boy who would one day help forge a new nation. But tonight, there is no war, no politics, only the peace of the countryside, and the first cries of a newborn named George. On February 22nd, 1732, in the English colony of Virginia, a child was born to a modest but well-connected family on a quiet plantation known as Pope's Creek, near the Potomac River. His name? George Washington. Though history would remember him as a general, a leader, and the first president of the United States, he began life in the soft cradle of rural simplicity. George was born to Augustine and Mary Ball Washington. His father, Augustine, had children from a previous marriage, but George was Mary's firstborn. The world he entered was one of vast forests, quiet rivers, and a lifestyle deeply rooted in nature, faith, and hard work. The Washingtons were not the wealthiest family, but they were comfortable and respected. In the early 18th century, life on the Virginia frontier was dictated by the rhythms of the land. Seasons shaped the calendar, and most families, including the Washingtons, worked the soil to sustain themselves. The homes were simple yet sturdy, built with handmade bricks, wooden beams, and wide hearths that warmed families through chilly winters. Augustine Washington was a landowner and a planter. He grew tobacco, the cash crop of the colonies, and dabbled in mining and milling. George, as a baby, would have been rocked to sleep by the crackle of a fire, the creak of wooden floors, and the low hum of conversation among family members at the hearth. George's mother, Mary Ball Washington, was known for her strong will and deep devotion to her children. Described as serious and religious, she instilled discipline and moral character in her son from a young age. She believed in the value of hard work and personal responsibility. While Mary could be stern, she loved her children dearly and raised them with the values she believed would guide them to lead honest and respectable lives. His father, Augustine, was more adventurous. Educated in England, he sought opportunities and moved the family several times to improve their fortunes. These relocations would later influence George's adaptability and resilience. Sadly, Augustine passed away when George was just 11 years old. This early loss left a deep impression on the young boy. His inheritance was modest compared to his older half-brothers, but the lessons of independence, thrift, and leadership began to take root. George's childhood home was surrounded by fertile fields, towering trees, and the slow-moving waters of Virginia's rivers. He learned to ride horses, explore the forests, and tend to farm animals. These early experiences, close to nature, built not only his physical strength, but his awareness of the natural world. He was tall for his age, quiet, and often thoughtful. In those days, children played games like tag, marbles, and blind man's bluff. George likely played with his siblings and friends on the lawn outside the family home. At night, the family would gather for prayers, and by candlelight, George may have heard stories from the Bible or tales of English history, tales of knights, kings, and virtue. These bedtime rituals were not unlike those we share now. Quiet, grounding moments before sleep. You may have heard the story of young George Washington chopping down a cherry tree and bravely admitting to his father, "I cannot tell a lie." This tale, as charming as it is, was created by a biographer named Mason Locke Weems many years after George's death. While the story isn't true, it does reflect something deeper: the reverence people had for George's honesty and character. Whether or not the cherry tree tale happened, it's true that George valued truth, honor, and humility, qualities that his mother and early environment helped nurture. George did not attend college. Unlike many of his peers, he received only a basic education in subjects like arithmetic, reading, geography, and penmanship. His schooling was often interrupted, especially after his father's death, and he did not travel to England for advanced studies like his older brothers. Instead, George became largely self-taught. He had a natural talent for surveying and mathematics. By the time he was a teenager, he was practicing his handwriting diligently, copying moral maxims into his notebook. These were known as the rules of civility and decent behavior in company and conversation. They included instructions like, Speak not when others speak. Sleep not when others speak. Let your discourse with men of business be short and comprehensive. These sayings may seem old-fashioned now, but they helped shape the dignity and calm presence that would define Washington in his adult life. After Augustine's death, George became close to his half-brother, Lawrence Washington. Lawrence had served in the British military and had married into the wealthy Fairfax family. He provided young George with a model of worldly success, poise, and leadership. It was through Lawrence's connections that George was introduced to the world of surveying and the upper levels of Virginia society. He often visited Lawrence's home, Mount Vernon, which would eventually become George's own beloved estate. The wide verandas, gentle hills, and views of the Potomac River left a deep impression on him. Even as a boy, George showed a quiet longing for stability, a home of his own, a legacy he could build with strength and purpose. By the time George Washington was 15 years old, the landscape around him was both a playground and a challenge. Colonial Virginia was a patchwork of farms, forests, and rivers, but much of the land was still wild and untamed. George had developed a fascination with the outdoors and a natural talent for observation. He loved horses and riding through the fields, but his real passion was for surveying, measuring the land and understanding its geography. Surveying was a practical skill highly valued in the colonies. It was the art and science of mapping out property lines, navigating terrain, and making sense of the wilderness. Surveyors played an important role in the expansion of settlements, helping settlers claim and protect their land. Thanks to his brother Lawrence's influence and connections, George had access to books on surveying and mathematics, subjects he eagerly studied. Without formal advanced schooling, he taught himself many of the tools and techniques needed. In 1747, at just 15 years old, George Washington officially became a surveyor for the county of Culpeper in Virginia. This was a significant responsibility for a teenager. His job was to measure and map lands for settlers and speculators. The work required patience, precision, and courage. Surveying meant long days outdoors, often in difficult weather, with risks of wild animals or unfriendly encounters. George carried simple yet essential tools for his work. The compass allowed him to find directions. A Gunter's chain, a measuring chain 66 feet long, helped him calculate distances, and a surveying compass helped determine angles and boundaries. He would record his measurements in notebooks and create rough maps by hand, carefully noting landmarks like trees, rivers, hills, and rocks. Imagine him pausing under the shade of an oak tree to jot down notes, or studying a distant ridge to plot his next course. The work was methodical and sometimes exhausting, but George had a quiet determination that kept him focused. The Virginia frontier was rugged and wild. Forests were thick with oak, pine, and chestnut trees. Deer, bears, and wolves roamed the woods, while snakes and insects were ever present. Surveying trips could last days or even weeks. George often traveled on horseback, carrying a small pack with essentials, food, water, his tools, and sometimes a pistol for protection. Night brought its own challenges. After setting up camp, he might have written in his journal by firelight, reflecting on the day's work. The night sounds of the wilderness, hooting owls, rustling leaves, distant howls, surrounded him as he drifted to sleep. This time in the wilderness taught George many things: patience, self-reliance, observation, and respect for nature. He learned how to read the landscape, predict weather changes, and navigate without modern tools. The solitude also gave him time for quiet thought and reflection. Away from the distractions of society, he developed a deep sense of calm and confidence. Surveying also connected George to the people around him. He met settlers, traders, Native Americans, and other surveyors, learning to communicate and negotiate boundaries peacefully. Even as a young surveyor, George showed signs of leadership. His work was respected for its accuracy and fairness. He took his responsibilities seriously, knowing that the boundaries he marked could mean security or dispute for families. One story from this time tells how George once helped a settler whose land had been wrongly claimed by another. Using his skill and knowledge, George stood firm and helped resolve the disagreement peacefully. Though surveying may seem far from the battlefields and halls of power he would later know, it was here, in the quiet wilderness, that George Washington learned the skills that would serve him throughout life. Measuring the land taught him discipline and attention to detail. Navigating forests taught him strategy and patience. Facing the unknown taught him courage and calm. His years as a surveyor were a slow, steady preparation for the challenges ahead, a foundation built on quiet strength, much like the land itself. As you settle down tonight, imagine yourself beside young George, under a canopy of stars, listening to the gentle rustle of leaves. Feel the calm of the quiet forest, the cool night air, and the promise of a new day's adventure. Sleep gently with the knowledge that sometimes, the greatest leaders begin by learning the simple, steady skills of the earth.